Hi again, Dan Hickey here with another short video concerning the practices, principles, and policies of educational assessment. Today's video is on the topic of formative assessment. You're probably familiar with formative assessment if you're watching this video. Formative assessment means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To many assessment scholars, the main point is that formative assessment is a planned process. It's not really a test. You don't refer to it as a specific test, but rather it's a part of a broader instructional strategy, or as I like to characterize it, an instruction assessment ecosystem. Formative assessment was popularized by Black and Willems. It's been around for quite some time. They make the distinction between formative assessment as assessment for current learning. That distinguishes it from summative assessment of prior learning. Black and Willems also distinguish between evaluative assessment. These distinctions are rooted in a notion of assessment purposes. Black and Willems and others caution against using assessments for multiple purposes. They do point out, though, that formative assessment can be used by teachers to adjust their ongoing instructional procedures, and it can also be used by students to adjust their current learning tactics. In my own work, I focus on using formative assessments really by classroom communities to adjust the way that participants interact with each other. And in my teaching and in my research, I think of in terms of formative, summative, and evaluative functions. This broader view of learning assumes that most assessment practices can and do serve multiple functions, and that good assessment is really about aligning these functions within and across different assessment practices. This leads me to think a lot about what I think of as really the transformative functions of assessment. Assessments are good for transforming and really changing learning environments in productive ways. But I also worry a lot about the deformative functions, whereby assessment sort of transforms a really nice interactive learning environment into essentially test preparation. Mostly in this video, I'm going to focus on the mainstream sort of view of formative assessment as associated with Black and Willems, Poppins, and others. Let's talk about what formative assessment is not. Again, to mainstream assessment theorists, formative assessment is very different than summative assessment. In my opinion, most assessments do serve both of these purposes. If we think about, for instance, teachers using the evidence from an end of semester exam to improve their teaching, they're learning how to teach better, but that assessment was actually pretty summative for students, and they may have not gotten any formative feedback at all on it. What formative assessment definitely is not is commercial test preparation products. Now, this is a big issue right now. Many vendors have sort of seized on the notion of formative assessment and its popularity. What they're really selling are sort of interim or benchmark assessments that really are computer-based test prep that train students to solve or to recognize specific items that might appear on a high-stakes exam. Now, we know that these practices can indeed raise scores a little bit because they train students to recognize isolated associations, and a few of those might appear on a high-stakes test, and if those are particularly help them do better on a very difficult item that they would otherwise get wrong, then their score will go up. The problem is that information, that learning, isn't really useful for anything else but raising the score on that test, or for those particular items that happen to be on that test. So I want to be really careful not to confuse these products that are on the market, often marketed as formative assessment. Now, in my opinion, I extend those concerns to a lot of educator-developed formative assessments. What I see in my research and in my practice is lots of teachers spending a lot of time sort of going over exams that have been assigned grades already, and a lot of times students really end up arguing about the wording of the item or what they were thinking, or arguing for more points, and that may or may not be very formative. But if that information isn't really used to support broad learning, you really want to be careful how much time you invest giving formative feedback, or you want to think about your formative assessments really on more low stakes or no stakes assessments. There are literally thousands of studies supporting the educational usefulness of formative assessment. My own thinking was shaped by a couple of papers that were published quite some time ago. Fredrickson and Collins introduced this notion of systemic validity in 1989. They argued that the introduction of assessments into an educational ecosystem should lead to broader cognitive outcomes and broader instructional changes. That same year, Royce Sadler published what was a very influential and a very important paper on formative assessment. I really like Sadler's paper because he introduced a distinction that I think has gotten lost in a lot of the discussion of formative assessment. Sadler argued that it was important for students to learn to judge their work using what he called fuzzy criteria. In other words, students should get used to arguing with each other and with their instructors and their peers over the meaning of the criteria by which the work is being judged, because it's in that nuance, it's in that fuzziness where actually the really important, or much of the really important parts of disciplinary knowledge reside. Most people associate formative assessment with the review that Black and Willems published in 1998. Reviewed over 250 studies on classroom assessment. More recently, Randy Bennett at Educational Testing Service published a critical review of formative assessment that captured for me many of the concerns that I've had of the prior research on formative assessment. Bennett characterized some of these studies as really supporting the educational equivalent of an urban legend. In my opinion, formative assessment is often really overstated. People do studies where they compare how much someone learns on an assessment or when there's formative feedback provided, and then they give them another version of that assessment, and then they compare that with students who didn't get that feedback. Well, for me, that's really a test of educational malpractice. You should always be giving formative feedback. What we don't know, and what is remarkably difficult to study for complicated reasons having to do with assessment validity, is the impact of different formative assessment practices. So I'm going to encourage you to be a little skeptical of whether or not you're making good use of your time. For example, many educators will often spend quite a bit of time reviewing completed assessments. You want to be careful. You want to really make sure you want to listen to the conversation that happens around those reviews and ask yourself, is this really as good as if we were doing a lesson on this unit? So what I'm trying to explain here is really fairly complicated, and some of you are probably a little confused at this moment when talking about this notion of fuzzy criteria. Well, the fuzzy criteria are important. Why shouldn't we spend the time discussing scores? Let me use an example from my own assessment course. Over the years I've been teaching this course, I've learned that many times students have a very weak, fragile understanding of validity. They confuse validity with reliability, and they really don't understand the difference between the different types of validity evidence, be they criterion, content, or construct. So in previous years, I've given sort of formative assessments worth some points, sort of quizzes to see, to double check students' understanding and provide feedback. And when students often get sort of the characterizations wrong, then we come back and have a discussion about it. And I still could tell from my final exams that students really still weren't getting that. In other words, the discussion really wasn't that productive. They really weren't, as we say, making sense of the fuzzy criteria. What they were making sense of is why they answered in a particular way, and they weren't thinking more broadly about the distinctions between the types of validity evidence. So in response to that, I sort of ditched those formative assessments and do this much more informal assessment whereby I ask students to consider which of these types of validity evidence is most relevant to them given their current role and given their current domain and where they work. And I find that that's a very informal thing. They aren't even really being formally assessed at all. And the feedback they're receiving doesn't even really look like feedback, because what they're doing is they're comparing what they've done with what other students have done. So for my money, that's been a very efficient way of getting students to make sense of fuzzy criteria without spending a bunch of time sort of giving formative assessments and then going over the grades and going over feedback and having one or two students arguing sort of vehemently for a particular characterization in ways that doesn't even really get at the more general criteria. One way that assessment experts like Jim Poppins think about formative assessment is in terms of learning progressions. There's really a sequence of building blocks, and you want to think about, well, what do students have to master on their way to achieving sort of a higher order curricular aim? The crucial thing is that a learning progression really forces you to think about what those building blocks are and what the sequence should be, what sequence they should be presented in. So take, for example, my assessment class. One of my curricular aims is having students develop high-quality assessments in particular assessment formats. So one set of enabling knowledge are really the general guidelines for writing items. Another set of enabling knowledge are the more specific guidelines for that particular item format. Now, it made sense, right, to do the general ones first and then get at the specific ones. That's what I mean by sequencing. A lot of times your decisions about the most appropriate sequence actually won't be that straightforward. But those enabling skills lead to this sub-skill of being able to develop good items, and in doing so, that meets my curricular aim. Let's talk about the steps in building a learning progression. One of the most important things is you have to really understand your curricular aim. And this is probably one of the most important things about formative assessment, is the way that it really pushes instructors to think hard about their curricular aims. You have to think about how the knowledge develops, the order in which the knowledge develops. You really want to think about what are the bottlenecks. For example, in my assessment course, I know that a big bottleneck for many students is distinguishing between the practices of education and the processes of learning. So this is why it's really important to define a curricular aim. So in fact, in my assessment course, I address that bottleneck at the outset. Students are really pushed hard to define a curricular aim that's not sort of a project or a curricular activity itself. Finally, you really want to think about how your curricular aim connects to students' experience. This is where I diverge a lot from other people in formative assessment. I think this is particularly important. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how different curricular aims connect to the experience and aspirations of different students, because I think that really helps them learn it, and it's a good way to connect. Once you've really unpacked your curricular aim, you want to identify the essential sub-skills and the enabling knowledge, as I showed in the previous slide. Now here's where you have to make some tough decisions. Jim Poppins and other assessment experts say that you should define an assessment for each building block. Now, the real issue here is how formal of an assessment should that be? In my assessment course, I don't actually have like a quiz or something to see whether or not students understand the general guidelines before I apply them. That really wouldn't be appropriate. What I do instead is have them look at the relevance of those guidelines for their curricular aim and see where they're using them. So I don't sort of sequence it quite as strictly as Poppins and others would have you do, where you're having a series of very discrete competencies. Instead, what I do is I have students use that knowledge, and in the process of using that knowledge, I have them generate some evidence that they actually come to an understanding of that knowledge. Finally, you have to think about the sequence, regardless of whether you're formally or informally, or not even in assessing the building blocks. You really have to give some time to thinking about the order. Again, it's not usually as straightforward as it was in my example. So if we think about formative assessment as a process or really a principle, well, it's really a lot of work to think about what this means for you in your classroom, because it's really a very involved process. What I'm going to do now is talk about three different approaches that you might consider in your own formative assessment work in your classroom, and ask you to go back and revisit these approaches in light of your own curricular aims and your role in education, and think deeply about which one is most appropriate for you, and then try to unpack it by sort of applying it to your setting. Let's start with what Poppins calls his 4 levels approach. Now this talks about different levels of instruction, so we can distinguish between the instructor's instructional adjustment from their formative assessment, from the evidence that's generated, and we can distinguish between students adjusting their learning tactics. We can also talk about this thing that I feel is so important, which is this classroom climate shift. This is what I think about in terms of the sort of the classroom community. And then finally, we can think about a school-wide implementation. So this is a really sort of ambitious way of thinking about formative assessment. And that might not be the best way for you to think about it. You might instead think in terms of Poppins' 5 applications approach. In this approach, we can distinguish between very immediate instructional adjustments. Now, Poppins distinguishes that between sort of near future instructional adjustments. This is what I think of in terms of sort of proximal curriculum-oriented assessments. Third, there's what Poppins calls the last chance instructional adjustments. These are sort of remedial things. These are things that happen. This is your last opportunity to sort of review something before you move on, to make sure that Struggling students have mastered, you're giving feedback, you're giving additional instruction after some students have struggled on a summative assessment. This is distinguished in turn from the fourth application, which is learning tactic adjustment. This is where instructors are using evidence from instructions to really change, to modify their instruction. And then fifth, we can distinguish between classroom climate shifts. This is where you're really looking at the culture of the classroom and using evidence from assessment to change that. Now, in my opinion, it's really dangerous to do classroom climate shifts with formal assessments. You really want to be thinking in terms of the way that students are interacting with each other around very informal assessments of student discourse. Now, Dylan Willems has recently introduced his 5 strategies approach, and I really like this one myself. I find this particularly useful and is probably the one general framework that's most consistent with the sort of framework that I use in my work. First, you think about clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions and criteria for success. You want to give that a lot of thought. You want to think hard about sort of what are your broader goals. Are you really interested in individual understanding, or is your primary goal really about student interaction with each other? Well, those lead to very different kinds of formative assessment practices. After you've done that, you want to think about engineering effective classroom discussions, activities, and learning tactics. These can elicit evidence of learning, and if you think about evidence of learning very broadly, you can think of students learning to interact with each other in productive ways. Again, that's quite a bit different than students learning as represented on a formal classroom assessment, and different still from the learning that's represented on a high-stakes achievement test. Whatever kind of learning you're focusing on, you want to think about the feedback that moves that learning forward. If your learning is mostly focused on interaction, well, then you want to think about feedback that moves that interaction forward. Willems' fourth strategy is one that's perhaps most important to me, and that's activating learners as instructional resources for each other. This can be really difficult to do around formal classroom assessments because they really take the learning out of the hands of the students. And by the time students are sort of formally evaluating stuff, people just don't want to grade each other's work and discuss stuff when the stakes are high. So my advice is to really focus on very informal assessments and have students giving each other feedback. One of the best ways of doing this is having students use digital technologies to produce work that their classmates can see and comment on and give feedback. You can do this in discussion forums as well, but you really want to encourage students to discuss and impact each other's thinking. Finally, you want to activate students as owners of their own learning. If you think about learning in terms of the way that knowledge connects with students' own experience and interests and aspirations, well, the students themselves are the experts in what that looks like. And so you want to give them sort of the sense that they know more about the intersection of course knowledge with their own interests than really anybody else. Let's wrap this up by thinking about the obstacles to formative assessment, or as I would probably put it, what are the obstacles to providing feedback that is both useful and used to improve teaching and learning? You know, Poppins and others argue that much of the resistance of formative assessment comes from misunderstanding regarding formative assessment practices. They think of it as sort of an assessment, they don't think of it as a process. Or that it's only something for the instructor. Poppins argues that other people think that it's difficult to change the classroom climate. Now, in my experience, students and instructors really shape each other, and they often reinforce kinds of practices. Again, a lot of the problem with formative assessment is it divulges into this sort of corrosive discussion over what students were thinking when they took the test or how the exam items were written. We train students to expect that if they've completed a lesson that they should be able to get every single answer correct on an exam, and that doesn't have to be the case. You want to really adjust your grading practices to capture the full range so that some students who really do know more can demonstrate that knowledge. What you really want to try to get out of, though, is where you have students where formative feedback sessions, again, they just divulge into this fight for points. If that's happening and students aren't really arguing in ways that should be expected to build more general knowledge, then you're probably not making good use of your instructional time, and you might have been better off doing your formative feedback around less formal assessments. Certainly another big issue here has to do with the relationship between formative assessment and accountability tests. That is definitely an issue. Now, in my opinion, absolutely formative assessment and good formative feedback and the alignment of informal assessments with semi-formal classroom assessments to formal achievement tests really can impact achievement. But it's actually not as easy as people think it is. So I'm going to wind this down by encouraging you to experiment with formative assessment, but think deeply about what kind of learning is really happening, what kind of interaction is happening. Are students really discussing the underlying concepts? Or are you really ending up with students just fighting for points and arguing with you about the way that you worded the items? And if that's what's happening, you may not really be getting all the learning that you're thinking, and you might have better spent that time extending a lesson. That's all for now on the topic of formative assessment. I want to really encourage you to get access to some resources, textbooks, and think deeply about these principles as they relate to your own instructional practice. Thank you very much.